decide whether it was a real vocabulary. We would first have to identify what we wanted to regard as the normative vocabulary in that community we're looking at. And then we'd have to see whether this putative vocabulary, as it were, plugged into the normative vocabulary in the right sort of way. And if it did, then we'd have a reason for saying that, as it were, these creatures, in using this putative vocabulary, were engaged in the general practice which we wanted to treat as we were making assertions within this community. Now, I think that we could say all that. We could probably say all that without getting into interpretation. So, while it's true that the sort of story about the normative practice is going to play a very key role in deciding what counts as vocabulary and what doesn't, it's not true that, in my view at least, I'm not sure where Dave stands on this, that we don't have to go as far as Davidson in thinking that in order to treat what they're doing as an interesting sense linguistically, we actually have to get involved in the interpretive project.
Okay, maybe not the interpretive project, but don't you have to be attributing to them, I mean, maybe even attributing the use of normative vocabulary is more than is needed, but you've got to be characterizing what they're doing as something that's correct under some circumstances and not correct under other circumstances, which I would have thought was something that you can't do in the purple.
Oh no, well in that case I think we disagree. I mean, I think what we have to say is that, look, they have a normative practice, so that, as it were, I mean, if we flag items in their vocabulary as being kind of expressions of norm, and then cashed out the import for them of those terms, I mean, we might have more general emotions in play, emotions of the kind of social constraints that the creatures within this community place on one another, how their behaviour is influenced by the attitudes of their fellows and so on. And then within that more general story, you tell a more specific story about the particular kinds of constraints which operate in the case of these vocabularies. I think we could do all that without, as it were, using the term correct full voice at any point in the story. Because we'd be telling a story about their use of their term correct. And we wouldn't need to use our term correct in any special way that we wouldn't when we were talking about any other kind of stuff. So I think this is a very interesting issue, and if we do disagree on that, then it's an interesting disagreement, I think. But that's the side of it I would like to take in.
Jason has a sort of wiggling finger on this, and I take it that everyone else that I have seen and acknowledged had an actual hand. So Jason gets a small.
I am small. And so are my thoughts. This issue seems to mirror a disagreement in linguistics about whether you should use correct full voice, which also came up in Bruin's discussion of whether something was ungrammatical or merely not used. That's what I mean, it's not in the whole thing. But actually it's largely a trans-Pacific distinction in linguistics, or so I'm told, that Australians tend not to use correct full voice. So maybe you're an Australian philosopher.
Well, that would confirm those hypotheses, wouldn't it?
Paul.
I've got a question that does relate to what counts as vocabulary. Specifically, it's about what you envisage as the extent of scientific vocabulary, which obviously plays a crucial role in the case, and then subsequently on the distinction between realism and quasi-realism. And we can put a standard sense on the scientific vocabulary. Does it extend, that the House of Questions extend to our normal description of things around us? Pretty standard accepted description with all except what's this room and various things about it. Is that all part of it?
Well, that's a very good question, but it's a very good question to pose to someone like Blackburn, who wants to draw a distinction between, in some sense, the really real vocabulary and the quasi-real vocabulary. Because it's the kind of question which puts people like that, which puts standard expressivists, local expressivists on the spot. And of course, I want them to be on the spot because I want the right answer to be that there isn't any interesting or viable way of drawing that sort of distinction. And that's one reason why that's not the case. Another reason, and perhaps an even more interesting one in this context, and one which Blackburn himself is certainly sensitive to, is that anyone who's sort of tempted by Humean projectivism is certainly tempted by the thought that causal talk is projected. And so the idea that that we lump the causal stuff into the stuff that we're not going to treat in the expressivist way, it just looks like a non-starter from that point of view. And Blackburn, very much to his credit, has some very interesting discussion, as it were, the niceties of that sort of issue in one or two of his papers.
It is a question for Blackburn, I think, but I'll just push it a little bit further, because if you accept that, or Blackburn accepts that, then the move to accepting that certain descriptions of that we might describe factually as a certain sort of behaviour, as taking an electrical piece of equipment and pressing it on, etc., which you might describe factually, would be described equally, I should think, as so-called cruelty, torture, and so on, for any amount of evaluative.
Well, I'm not sure if that in itself is exactly, if that's exactly the same problem.
Well, I see it as a problem for distinguishing vocabulary. So of course going to count vocabulary, because the notion of a scientific vocabulary is going to become very, very hard.
Well, I certainly agree with you absolutely that there's a, in a sense, things are much worse than I painted them here for people who do want to draw that kind of distinction. And that's one of the reasons why they're not sure.
I have Peter, Uriah, and also Jim now, and given that we're about less than 20 minutes late, it's unlikely to have an opportunity. But has there been anyone who's been trying to catch my attention for this? Jason?
Actually, on that last point, it was actually one of those.
The finger.
Yeah, we're going to be what? Yes. Well, you should have.
Go ahead.
Go ahead with it? Yes. Okay. Insofar as one is prepared to argue, and this brings us back to the point that was made yesterday evening, as between Bob Brandon on one side and such authors as Jerry Fodor on the other, we're prepared to consider that concepts do have a causal role in psychology, and that the social acceptance of a norm plays a complicated kind of causal role in the behaviour of organisms within that community, then how can the causal criterion disallow normative concepts and other kinds of concepts that are supposed to be discounted by it as a relation between causal relation between facts and the types of vocabulary? One might suggest perhaps that the relationship between neutrons in a particle accelerator and physical theory is a little more direct, although that seems a little bit difficult to give a straightforward and a priori argument for, and I would be interested to know how you think that distinction would be drawn in the application of causal criteria.
Okay, well, once again, I think, like the last question, in a sense, this is the kind of question which just emphasises the difficulties for people who want to rely on the L criterion are worse than identification is being. The main point which we were trying to make, I'm trying to make rather hurriedly here, and which we're trying to make in the background paper, is that in discussions by Blackburn and by other people of the impact of semantic minimalism on expressivism, there seems to be, two things seem to be kind of systematically confused. One is the point that expressivists can perfectly well distinguish between the functions of different discourses as vocabularies, and some of those distinctions may go in causal terms. So something like the Eliot criterion may play a role. The other is the idea that any of that story about